Greetings, audiophiles and Legend of Korra fans. Oh, who am I kidding? Welcome, Bolin fans, to my reading of my fanfiction, Castle of Glass. Legend of Korra and the characters therein belong to their respective owners and creators. The original characters and the premise of this story belong to me. Enjoy! Part 6. Spirit Girl. Bolin was finding ways to distract himself. If he couldn't find something to do on Varric's ship, where could he? He checked room after room, eyes wide with excitement and wonderment at each new discovery. New clothes, new foods, new animal friends. Well, maybe not animal friends. That adventure had ended up with him receiving a firm bite on the backside, potentially ruining his new raincoat. He slammed the door shut with a grunt, wiping his brow with an exaggerated motion as though he were still on camera. He hesitated, looked around. The ship was warm and close inside, with many hallways and doors. It felt empty. Maybe it was the tennis court with no one there to play against him. Maybe it was all the food with no one to eat with him. Everyone else was very busy. Mako was on deck, training with Korra. Kaya was on the deck below him, seeing to little Jinora. He thought of the girl trapped in the spirit world. How lonely she must be. Even Pabu wasn't with Bolin. The fire ferret was snoozing with Naga on deck. He rubbed the back of his neck, wondering if one of these levels had a swimming pool. Or maybe he could just convince Mako to pay attention to him. Ever since Mako had become a cop, he had been so absorbed in his own dealings. For a while, Bolin thought it had felt good to get back at his brother, to be the big movie star. This time he was the important, successful brother. But in the end it had felt hollow and lonely. He even missed Varric. The man may have been a criminal, but he had seemed to think Bolin was worth something. Bolin thought about Ginger, his attractive co-star. She had finally kissed him before they left, and even that seemed empty. Why did everything he thought would matter end up not feeling like it should? He hadn't felt like he had truly succeeded at anything since he had fought Amon's troops. Then he had been useful. But they were going to war again, so perhaps he could recapture some of that shine. Bolin joined the others on deck in time to hear Tenzin's tense voice instructing Korra as she took out some of her boundless anger on a straw-stuffed dummy. Bolin spotted Mako standing across the deck and jogged over to him. He tried to keep the mood light as he poked fun at his brother's frequent poor choices when it came to women. He draped an arm companionably around Mako's shoulders. "So, have you told Korra yet about how when you guys broke up, you kinda started dating Asami while Korra was off being attacked by dark spirits?" Bolin had meant for this to be a gentle ribbing, but Mako was serious as ever. "Would you keep it down?" The taller man glanced nervously at the Avatar, who pounded the long-suffering straw dummy with her airbending. Leave it to her to make airbending look aggressive, Bolin thought, raising an eyebrow. Mako pressed on. "I'm waiting for the right moment." Bolin felt annoyance flow through him. He fell back on an exasperated exclamation. "Oh! Mako, a wise man once told me that delivering bad news to a girlfriend is like ripping off a blood-sucking leech." He put on his most clownish expression, even as he hit Mako with his brother's own words. "You just have to do it fast and get it over with." "I hate it when you listen to me," Mako griped, avoiding looking at Bolin's goofy grin. "Fine." Bolin gave his brother's shoulders an encouraging shake, and Korra chose that moment to behead the practice dummy. Both young men flinched. Bolin felt his lip curl in a nervous wince. Just then, he was glad that he and Korra hadn't worked out. He still found her very attractive, but she was definitely a little too angry, at least lately. "Good luck, bro," Bolin hissed to Mako as the firebender bent to pick up the dummy's charred head. Korra moved to talk to her boyfriend, and Bolin wandered over to stand beside Tenzin. He could sense the airbender's tension, something he wasn't used to. Tenzin always seemed uptight, but his style of bending required a certain inward calm. Now the man's peace was broken. Bolin hesitated, then spoke quietly. She'll be all right. Jinora, we'll get her back. Tenzin blinked a few times, then fixed his gray eyes on the young man beside him. Bolin was startled by the intensity of the gaze and immediately fell back on what he knew. Humor. Pie? He offered, holding up what remained of a slice that he had been munching on. It drooped limply in his grasp, and a large blueberry fell with a plop onto the deck. Tenzin walked away. Bolin sighed, half in sadness and half in relief. He absently stuffed the pie into his mouth, wiping the mess it made on his lips with the back of his hand. Then he leaned over the edge of the ship, feeling the icy air ruffle his dark hair and fill his lungs with cold. For a fleeting moment, a memory flashed into his mind. A face. Bright blue eyes against dark skin. The sassy way she smiled. Her imperfect laugh. He liked that laugh. He allowed himself to be lost in those memories. They seemed a world away, even though the ship was headed straight back for the place where he had met her. Kita. He recalled her name being shouted after her as she ran him over the first time he had encountered her. Would he see her again? He didn't get his hopes up. She was one girl in a big tribe. Tenzin's raised voice got Bolin's attention. Kaya and Bumi had joined their brother, and Bolin guessed that Bumi had just told one of his war stories because Tenzin had the look he always wore when he had reached the end of his patience. Bolin saw Mako walking over to join them as well. Are we almost there? Bolin questioned. Asami strode up to join the group. Almost, but the slender woman hesitated. I just picked up a distress signal from the southern troops. There's a problem. It turned out that the problem was a blockade. Even as well-equipped as Varric's ship was, there was no way it could punch through. The flying bison was called for. The creature had been floating easily along behind the ship. It landed on deck with a lightness that always surprised Bolin. The bison were so immense, yet so graceful. He turned to see Jinora cradled in her father's arms as he brought her up from below decks. She was wrapped in warm blankets, but her face was pale. Kaya hovered beside her, healing water shining between the woman's fingers. As Tenzin moved to the bison, Jinora's arm fell free of her wrappings. Bolin rushed forward and gently set the little girl's fragile hand back in place on her stomach. He glanced up at Tenzin and thought he caught sight of a tear in the tough man's eye. Bolin backed away, feeling awkward. It was easy enough to get over the blockade. Perhaps too easy, Bolin thought as he leaned over the side of the saddle and peered down. The air was thin and very cold, as high as they were. Still, they must have been very visible from below. He swallowed. Were they expected? Kita was feeling doubly annoyed. Her hair wasn't cooperating, and Prin was flapping around her, peeping with frustration at being so often ignored. The animal was not allowed in the healing hut, and the wind outside was too harsh for the small creature to fly safely. Owlbats usually stuck to forests, more sheltered from the frigid winds. As a result, Prin had been stuck in the dwelling hut for several days, and she was getting cabin fever. She landed on Kita's shoulder and began pulling her master's braid loose. "Stop it!" Kita scolded, trying to pull the strands away from her pet's beak. "No! Naughty!" Every time she tried to grab Prin, the owlbat flapped just out of her reach. "Where's Dad?" Kita wondered aloud. She hadn't seen him since yesterday. She had come in late from the healing hut the night before, and he had already been asleep in the darkened dwelling. He must have gotten up very early in the morning, Kita thought, as she once again attempted to twine her long hair into something resembling a tidy braid. As often as she wandered off without telling him, she still felt a little annoyed that her parent had gone without at least waking her to tell her where he was off to. He was probably helping around the camp, building new shelters or mucking out animal stalls, she thought darkly. Finally, her hair was passably tidied, and she headed for the healing hut. Everything there was quiet. The only sound was the gentle conversation of the women and the cough of a little boy who had a bad cold. Lily met Kita at the door. "Here," the older girl said, shoving a broom into Kita's hands. "I have to inventory the herbs. You'd better sweep up." Kita took the broom, managing to control her desire to smack Lily with it. The other healer always acted so high and mighty. Kita had discovered that Lily wasn't even native to the Southern Watertribe. Her mother had been from the Earth Kingdom, and Lily had been born there. Her father, a Southern tribesman, had brought his family back to live only a few years before. Lily still managed to act as though she was Watertribe royalty, Kita thought darkly, even if her mother was an earthbender. Kita began with the sweeping, then moved on to mopping as the day wore on. Someone put on the radio, but Kita didn't hear any more news of Bolin. Instead, a music program played. She let her feet try a few dance steps as she mopped. Someone chuckled at her. She jumped and turned to see Master Katara, who was grinding herbs in a mortar nearby. The old woman had been so quiet that Kita had forgotten she was there. "You like to dance?" Katara asked, smiling that warm smile that made Kita feel safe and loved in an instant. The smile that only such a woman could possess. "I know a few traditional dances," Kita answered, leaning on her mop for a moment. "My husband and I loved to dance. He was better than I. Our friend Toph always called him Twinkle Toes." Kita leaned her mop against an empty bed and sat down, her eyes wide with eagerness. She had been hoping for a long time that she might catch the waterbending master in a storytelling mood. She ached to hear stories of Avatar Aang. "Is it true that Master Toph invented metal bending?" "As far as I know," Katara chuckled. "Perhaps another earthbender could have figured it out as well, but never suggest that to Toph." "What was she like? What were all of them like?" Kita could barely contain herself. She was leaning so far forward on the edge of the bed that she almost toppled onto Katara's lap. The old woman was about to answer when the door to the hut burst open and chaos began. Suddenly the hut was filled with wounded, the smell of herbs replaced with the stench of blood. The pleasant music with the sound of pained screams. Kita was jostled aside. For a moment she just stood, mouth gaping open as the wounded kept pouring in. More than she had seen in one place in her entire life. Someone tripped over her mop. The healer turned and shouted in Kita's face, "Get moving, girl! Clear away your cleaning and get to work!" The tone was harsh, but it snapped Kita from her own mind. She rushed to get her mop and bucket out of the way and headed towards the door, where two women were struggling to triage the incoming wounded. Kita slipped, thinking it was mop water on the floor. She glanced down and her heart jerked unpleasantly. She'd slipped in a puddle of blood. Someone grabbed the hem of her tunic. "Help me," he whimpered. He had a bandage held over one eye. Kita turned to help the man who had addressed her, but instead found herself grasped by the shoulders and propelled once more towards the door. "He's not badly injured. Focus, girl!" Kita tried to focus her mind, as she always could when she was healing, to see the surging influx of wounded as blood cells coursing through veins. It helped a little as she reached the door. A figure had just entered, carrying another over his shoulders. "Dad?" Kita exclaimed. Her father stepped further into the hut, easing the young man he carried down from his shoulders. Kita's eyes quickly took in her parent. He was bleeding from his side and his nose, but his expression was cold as he spotted her. "Kita," he said flatly. He allowed himself to be ushered aside with the less severely injured. "Dad!" Kita tried to follow him, but someone pushed her back. She found herself looking down into the eyes of Master Katara. "Help him first." The aging healer gestured to the nearest cot, where lay the man Kita's father had carried inside. Kita shot her parent another concerned glance, but did as she was told. "Oh no," she breathed, seeing who lay before her. He was such a mess of blood and bruises she barely knew him. "Norak." She quickly summoned healing water to her hands and placed her fingertips across his ribs. His breaths were shallow and quick. Shock. She closed her eyes, trying to concentrate past the sound of screaming all around her, past the hurried words of the other healers. Normally, Kita would have had help with someone this severely injured, but help could not be spared. She inhaled sharply. This time his rib, the one weakened by his previous breaking, had punctured his lung. The lung was collapsing. She worked hurriedly to force the jagged bone back, to stop the blood pouring into his lung. So focused was she that she barely noticed when his hand closed around her upper arm. Then she felt him squeeze. His lung was safe for the moment, so she opened her eyes and met his gaze. Only one of his eyes focused on her. The other stared blankly, the pupil too large. Head wound, she thought desperately. She couldn't do this. She couldn't keep his chest in shape and heal a bad head wound. She needed help. But there could be no help. Everyone was busy. She watched the young man's lips move, blood trickling from between them. She instinctively took his hand and leaned forward, wiping the blood from his face with her sleeve. Tears were prickling in her eyes. He tried to speak again, and she leaned her head down to hear. Chief Tonrock. He's been captured. What? Kita exhaled. She felt the boy's hand go limp in hers. No, Noruk. No, don't you do this. She moved back, hands spread over his bloody chest. She reached with her healing bending. She found his heart and coaxed it to beat. Again and again she did this, but every time she thought it would beat on its own, it would stop. Finally, panting with the effort, she sat back, heaving a strangled sob. The boy lay still, tattered and dead. He had only been her age. She felt a hand close over her shoulder. She looked up. Her father stood above her, his eyes fixed on hers. She stood, and he gathered her into his arms for a moment. Only a moment, because Kita knew she had to help others live where she had failed with Noruk. Her father let her go, and she moved away, as he did. He went back and sat with the less injured, but he kept watching her, a silent sentinel. His gaze made her feel stronger for the first time that she could remember. The chaos seemed to last forever. Kita was bloody, sweaty, and so exhausted she thought she might just fall over when she finally got to her father. The wounded had stopped coming in, and the healers were able to catch up. Kita knelt and pressed her hands wearily to her father's bandages. Dad, Noruk said that Chief Tonrock had been captured, she reported urgently. I forgot about it in the heat of the moment, but we need to tell the other warriors. The warriors know. Her father's voice was low. How do you know that? Kita asked. Because I was with them. You? She almost caused him damage rather than healing in her surprise. She hastily jerked her hands away before she could harm him. You what? I went with the warriors. Several non-benders did. Don't give me that look, Kita. You can fight for your people even if you don't have bending. In fact, the benders were too confident because of their gift. How do you think poor Noruk was so gravely injured while I was only scratched? He charged in when he should not have. This is more than a scratch, and there's spirit magic in the wound, Kita said, her brows coming together. You shouldn't have gone, Dad, she snapped. You would have if you'd been in my place, he answered, sitting up straight. Maybe even a little proudly. I was of no use to anyone around the camp. You'd found your place here. He gestured to the healing hut. I saw people who needed my help, so I went. But Unalaq was ready this time. Our warriors' usual tricks didn't work. We were routed and cut down. Our chief was captured. We have to get him back, Kita said, as her father's wound knit itself together beneath her hands. We don't have the troops right now. Look at us. He gestured to the full healing hut. Kita bit down on her lip. She felt deeply angry that her father had gone off without telling her. But she didn't have a leg to stand on in that argument. She would have done the same, no question. She was pondering that even now. Master Katara could fight. Perhaps the women could take Unalaq by surprise in an attack of their own. Her mind was so lost in these thoughts that she barely registered when someone called Master Katara urgently from outside. She looked up as the doors opened again, and there stood the Avatar, with Masters Tenzin, Kaya, and Bumi. Tenzin was holding something in his arms. Kita gasped when she realized what it was. A little girl, one of Tenzin's daughters, judging by the air nomad garb. Go, Kita's father urged her. He must have seen his daughter's concern and eagerness to help. Kita drew closer, followed by a few other healers. The girl looked sick and pale. Her breath was slow and shallow, like one in a deep slumber. Kita watched Master Katara for a signal. She heard Tenzin's deep voice explaining. Her soul is trapped in the spirit world. Kita gasped. She had read of this happening in some of the texts her teacher had given her. She had never believed she would see someone who had been stricken with such a thing. Master Katara's voice was full of concern. Oh my goodness, how long has she been this way? Almost a week. Kaya spoke then. I've tried to keep her energy flowing, but I can feel her slipping away. You're the only one who can help her now, Mom. There was a desperation in the tough woman's blue eyes. Bring her this way, quickly. Master Katara bustled the group through the hut to a special room in the back. Kita had never been shown what was inside. She wanted to follow, but Katara called for no other healers. Kita found herself staring at the closed door through which the little girl had been carried. She felt a shiver run through her, and it was not from cold. Spirit magic in the wounds of the soldiers, now a child trapped in the spirit world. How could they come out of this one? Would this be the end of their home, their tribe, her world? She turned to see the front door of the healing hut still open. Everyone was so concentrated on the child that it had been left ajar. Kita strode across to close it, and as she did, she glanced outside. She found herself instantly captured by a pair of familiar, bright green eyes.